Here is Vinta Deepwater Blue, an interesting blue tone that brings purple undertones in the writing. And after you see it in the writing, noticing it in the chromatography makes the purple undertones painfully clear if you didn't see it before. Though I don't see the purple at all in the swatch. There can be some very noticeable tone shift as paper changes, especially to the more inexpensive papers, but it brings a very consistent amount of shading everywhere it travels. In non-fountain pen friendly paper, it would seem that Vinta tends to be a bit aggressive, needs a bit of anger management on these. So the aggression from this ink on most of the writing samples can, grain of salt there. The ink puts me in that kind of middle ground of I don't need to buy more of it, but would feel good about being gifted a bottle. So, for what that's worth.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Charlie. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
If you saw the last review and wondered where that kind of blue smudge came from, it came from here, really. Now, while it doesn't tend to feather or spread, it did smudge, and this wasn't immediate. This was, about 5 minutes later, it did smudge, but it doesn't smudge now. No feather, no spread, shades fairly well. It doesn't jump off the page as well as it does for Jump right here, where it's got a nice mid-tone in the J, lightens up at the U, a very dark at the MP at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we have no bleeding, no ghosting, easily writing back here.
Vinta makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Vinta. Here is Vinta Terracotta de Milli.
Here is Vinta La Union. Here is Vinta Hannah.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
This is very much the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does have just a little bit of shading. You can notice in Scotland, you don't have to get on a plane to see it, but the SCOT, Scott, is fairly monochromatic. It's just there. Land is where you start to see some of the tone shift, where the L is a bit darker than the A, the N gets darker a little bit more, and the D at the end quite a bit darker than it was before. There is some shading to be noticed, much more noticeable in there, where the T is light, the he is darker, the R lightens a little bit, and the E at the end does get a bit darker again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
While this is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, and I hope it comes through on camera, I'll only know in the edit, it does seem to have just a slight bit of a green tone to it. Likely the result of this paper, showing that the ink itself is a little bit translucent. Not a problem, just something to be considering when you are using toned papers. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade almost as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Very noticeable amount of shading in the Mathematician, because mathematicians are a bit shady, I would say. They hide everything with all the numbers. Look at the MA lighter. It gets a little bit darker into the T, much darker into the HE. The MA lightens up a little bit. The TI, darker. The CN at the end, just a tad bit lighter. Looking at the back of the page, I don't know that you really see it. I'm going to circle it. If you didn't see it, then this would be perfectly good for you to use, because you wouldn't have a problem with it. There's no real ghosting. There are a couple spots that it just got deeper. If you didn't see it when I first put this up, then there's not any kind of problem for you to use it. You'd be perfectly happy. If you did see it right away, then you might not want to write on the back of the page. Though I don't think if you did, you would ruin the notes on either side. You just have errand dots happening.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does not stand out well for me against this quad rule. They just seem a little bit too close to each other. I really see both at the same time. A little visually confusing for me, but maybe not for you. If this is the type of paper you use, then you're going to have to make that call. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting of any kind, making this great if you want to turn that page over and continue your writing.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there.
Here is Ackerman, their number 4 Nassau Blue. Here is Diatramentis Robert Koch Adular Blue. Here is Diamine Steel Blue. Here is Robert Oster Fire and Ice.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine and quite a bit flatter as a tone. Now, it does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade anywhere near as good as it did on the Clairfontaine. You can find occasional darker lines, but this is not really going to show up as a good shading ink for you. Don't look for it here. Would this be okay for a student to use? That's an on them thing. I wouldn't. I would want my writing to be a little bit more pronounced against this quad rule. But if that student doesn't have a problem reading it, I don't see a problem using it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Lamy Vibrant Pink. Here is Pilot Mixable Orange. Here is Private Reserve Black Cherry. Here is Diatramentis Emma Goldman Gold.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, but not noticeably lighter in any horrible way. It's not like we're going to have any trouble reading it. We don't have any real feathering. There's no real spread. No real spread, meaning sure you can find some areas that there's a little bit, but on the majority, it is doing a great job. It even has little bits of shading that show up, which is rather interesting. It is copy paper after all. This would make it a good ink to use if this is the type of paper you frequently use. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. What an amazing ink to use for 20-pound copy paper. If this is what you write on a ton, you might want to consider getting one of these, a bottle of this ink.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
Now, my Noodler's Charlie is a little dry as a pen, and I like it that way. The shading across papers was fairly consistent, and the tone of the ink was always stayed a blue with a slight purple lean to it. Off camera, I went for a wet medium, and this ink flipped on its head, becoming a very purple lean that showed blue tones in the shading. Both cases looked really cool, and both shaded well, while being well behaved, but for my money, I go for a dry fine or a dry stub to keep it a blue just because of its name.